What's going on, everyone? It's Steven here from the First Read Fantasy Football Podcast. And today, I've got 5 tips to help you in your 2021 fantasy football drafts. Let's get it. All right, real quick before we get started, as I mentioned, my name is Steven and I am one half of the First Read Fantasy Football Podcast. If you like the video, go ahead, check out the pod. We are on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, anywhere you listen to your podcasts, you can find us there. Also, check us out on social medias. We're on Twitter at First Read Pod and on Instagram at First Read Fantasy Podcast. Make sure you guys like and subscribe here on YouTube. Thanks for tuning in. And here we go. Let's get started. 5 tips to help you guys in your 2021 fantasy football drafts. All right. Tip number 1, research and preparation. And I know. This sounds kind of like a cop-out. It's like an easy answer, but trust me, it means more than anything. The thing that led me to having success in my fantasy drafts was being able to be prepared for the draft. I knew going into them what was going on in the NFL. I knew which players were trending upward or trending downward. You have to have an idea of what's happening in the NFL if you want to have success. So, tip number 1, research and preparation. Guess what? The best part is you're already halfway there by watching this video, by digging in and kind of getting an idea of what it means to have success in fantasy football. Other things you could do, podcast. Check us out. I promise we will be helpful in your fantasy drafts, but also there's so many other great resources. Go ahead and look them up on the internet. There's so many awesome podcasts, so many awesome content creators. Go check them out. Figure out what is going on in this fantasy football world, and who knows, you might even find yourself a new hobby that you start to love. All right, tip number 2, running backs are king. Look, it's a numbers thing here, okay? This is something simple in fantasy football, but it's super important. And I think especially this year, it's crucial to know and understand this problem. There are probably 12 people in your draft, maybe 10, right? 10 players at least in your league, almost guaranteed. There are 32 NFL teams. That means there's 32 starting running backs in the NFL to be spread out amongst 12 players. But the problem is not all 32 of those teams have good, solid starting running backs. So really what it comes down to is there's probably 20, maybe 20 guys that we can be confident in and feel comfortable having as kind of like our starting running back spots in our rosters. So you have to pay up early to make sure you can get some of those guys on your team. The fact of the matter is that the later rounds, once you get into rounds 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 in your drafts, wide receivers there are going to be really, really good, and your running backs are going to be a little rough. You might find 1 or 2 gems in that, but it's a lot easier to return your value drafting wide receivers in those rounds. So what we suggest is that you spend up early on those high caliber, solid running backs that you know are going to be good and have successful fantasy seasons. So prioritize running back early, and I promise it will pay off. Unless somebody gets injured, I cannot claim responsibility for that. All right, tip number 3, have a plan. Look, even if you don't know anything about football, there's no reason to walk blindly into your fantasy drafts, especially if there's $10 or bragging rights on the line. You don't want to lose because you did not have a plan. And specifically what I mean by that, there's a few different ways to do this, but I think the things that will be most helpful if you're new to fantasy football is, 1, look at the top 15 or so players that are expected to be in the fantasy football drafts. Know who you want to get in your first round. That will be your most important pick. That's why it's the first one, right? It's the most important one. So have a good idea of what you're going to do there. Also, have a good plan for the late rounds. There's a lot of really fun things that can happen in those late rounds. Maybe you pick somebody up who ends up breaking out and having a monster season this year. You can try to find those guys, and plenty of content creators out there have lists like that available. For example, our podcast last week was actually late round targets, guys that we like to look at in like the 10th and 11th, 12th rounds in your drafts that we think have potential to be awesome or at least super helpful and effective on your teams. And another thing that you can do is use rankings. So go out there, find a source that you trust, get a list together of rankings for each position. That way you know, hey, I think that Jonathan Taylor is going to be better than, I don't know, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, right? Like you want to have an idea of who you think is going to be better than the other players so that way you can make somewhat educated decisions and you don't need to do the research. Plenty of people are doing that. We're doing that. We are trying to make informed decisions and you can just reap the benefits. Go find rankings online somewhere. Okay, tip number 4, late round quarterbacks. Assuming that your league only allows for one starting quarterback, one of the best things that you can do is wait to draft that player. There's so much more value in the later rounds when it comes to quarterbacks than there are for wide receivers or running backs. The reason is that those top 15 to 20 quarterbacks, a lot of those guys, they score roughly the same amount of points every week, and there's not a huge variability. So there's not a lot of return if you draft the first quarterback in the second round. You're not going to get the same return as if you waited to draft the 10th quarterback in maybe the 10th round. So wait on your QBs. It's kind of the safest thing you can do in your fantasy drafts, especially if you're not really sure of who is good, who is worth what value. Just kind of wait until one comes to you. So while your opponents are spending up for Patrick Mahomes in the second round, you can wait to get Tom Brady or Ryan Tannehill way later on in like the 10th round, maybe the 9th round of the draft, and you won't be much worse than them at that position, but you'll have spent way less to get there. Okay, tip number 5, our last tip here for you is get your guys. Look, you are going to be so much more disappointed if the guy that you had a hunch about goes out and blows up this season than if the guy you had a hunch about ends up being not what you expected, right? So if you're missing out, that's going to feel worse than if you're wrong. So go ahead and take your chance, because even if you're wrong, you at least got to step out and do the thing and follow your hunches. And when that success happens, there is nothing more fun in fantasy football than being able to say, hey, I called my shot on that guy and I was right, and it returned and it did well for me. There's nothing more fun than when that gets to happen. And that's really what we're here to do, right? That's what fantasy football is for. We're here to have fun. So go get your guys. Don't be afraid to take them when you feel like you have to take them. Okay? Don't spend up crazy where it's unnecessary, but don't be afraid to reach a little bit to get your guy, just to make sure that no one else takes him from you. Because if you say, I'm uncertain about, I don't know, Laviska Shenault is somebody for me this year that I feel super confident in, I'm willing to put myself out there a bit and grab him for fear of somebody else getting to do that. And then I feel dumb for not getting the guy that I believed in. DeAndre Swift is another player that I truly believe in this year, and I'm drafting him all over the place because I am saying, hey, I think this guy has what it takes to be amazing. So do that. Be confident in yourself. Be confident in what you believe, and go out, get your guys in the draft. All right, guys, thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, go ahead, like and subscribe to the YouTube channel. That helps us a ton. Also, go ahead and check out the podcast. We are on Apple, Google, Spotify. Wherever you listen to podcasts, you can find us there. Reminder, my name is Steven. I am one half of the First Read Fantasy Football Podcast. We are fantasy football for average folks. Thanks, guys.